You've probably heard Rhett McLaughlin's story about deconstructing his Christian faith. It's pretty well known. But what happens when the deconstruction itself gets deconstructed? Today, we're diving into a source that does exactly that. It turns the microscope not on the questions he asked, but on the process he used to find the answers. Let's get into it. So that's the big question for us today, right? This is about way more than just one person's faith journey. It's really about how any of us look at our deepest beliefs. How do we actually stress test our own thinking when we're searching for what's true? We're about to walk through one really critical perspective on that very process. Okay, so the source we're digging into makes a really important distinction right from the get-go. It argues that the real issue isn't the questions Rhett asked. A lot of them are valid questions people have wrestled with for centuries. The critique is aimed at the supposed flaws in his methodology, the way he went about finding the answers. This quote really hits the nail on the head for this critique. The source is basically arguing that the process was driven less by a neutral, systematic investigation and more by a personal reaction to a specific kind of faith and, well, feelings. This idea really sets the stage for the specific thinking errors the source claims it found. So, what are these supposed errors in thinking? Well, the analysis we're covering gets very specific. It pinpoints what it calls logical fallacies and cognitive biases in the reasoning process. Let's take a look at the three main ones that the source highlights. First up is something called the synecdoche fallacy. I know, it's a fancy term, but the idea is actually super simple. It's when you mistake a part for the whole. The source argues this happened when a very specific American evangelical subculture was treated as if it represented all of Christianity across 2,000 years and the entire globe. The critique is that this really narrows the target, right? It makes it a lot easier to dismantle. Next, the source points to what's called an appeal to emotion. The argument here is that a doctrine's truthfulness was judged by how it felt. So, for instance, if the concept of hell feels morally uncomfortable, that feeling itself becomes the main argument for rejecting it. This, the source claims, lets you sidestep the much harder work of engaging with the deep theological or philosophical reasons why that doctrine might exist in the first place. And the third one is a classic we all can fall into: confirmation bias. The argument here is that once the deconstruction path got started, it sort of built up its own momentum by favoring any evidence that confirmed the new direction. According to the source, skeptical scholars were seen as objective, but Christian apologists were dismissed out of hand as being biased, without really applying that same critical standard to everyone's starting point. All right, so those are the alleged thinking errors in theory. But how did they actually play out in practice? This is where it gets interesting. This next section breaks it down with 3 specific case studies on the very issues Rhett raised. First up, the conflict between science and faith. Rhett's crisis point really stemmed from the clash between evolution and his understanding of Genesis. But the source argues this was a category error. He wasn't really wrestling with Christianity versus science. He was wrestling with a very specific literalist interpretation of Genesis versus science. By treating that one interpretation as the only Christian option, it created a false conflict that didn't necessarily have to exist. Second, the problem of hell. The objection was based on a deep moral revulsion to the idea of eternal torment, which is completely understandable. The source's rebuttal, though, again points to that synecdoche fallacy. It claims the deconstruction focused almost exclusively on the most severe fire and brimstone interpretation of hell, while pretty much ignoring the wide spectrum of views on judgment and the afterlife that have been part of Christian tradition for centuries. And third, we have the Canaanite conquest. The objection is straightforward. This looks like a divinely sanctioned genocide from a modern perspective. The source's counter is that this is an anachronism. It's judging an ancient text by modern 21st century standards. The argument is that to really get it, you have to engage with the text on its own terms, within its own ancient context, which frames the event not as random violence, but as a specific form of divine judgment. So, after laying out these specific cases, the analysis pulls everything back together to give its final verdict on the whole deconstruction process. So, what's the ultimate takeaway here, according to this particular source? The source claims the methodology had some fundamental flaws. There was an overgeneralization, taking one subculture and making it stand for the whole. There was emotional reasoning, where discomfort was prioritized over theological coherence. There was methodological inconsistency, applying different standards of proof to different sides. And finally, there was a conflation of the very real flaws of believers with flaws in the belief system itself. And this all leads to the source's final conclusion. The argument is that what was ultimately rejected wasn't the broad 2,000-year-old Christian faith, but a specific, narrow, and maybe even brittle version of it that just wasn't equipped to handle these tough questions. The deconstruction, in this view, was less a refutation of a global faith and more of an exit from a specific cultural bubble. And that leaves us all with a pretty challenging question, regardless of what we believe. This whole analysis hinges on methodology and bias. So, how can any of us make sure our own search for truth about any topic is as rigorous and objective as we think it is? How do we deconstruct our own thinking to find our own blind spots?